Welcome back to the channel, guys. I have become a Honda fanboy as of late. I have been getting Hondas left and right, and for good reason. It's hard to go wrong with any Honda. But my favorite motorcycles I've ever bought are right here. This one in particular, I have 27,000 miles. This I have 10,000 miles. These machines are some of the best motorcycles you could possibly get. It's the golden engine size. It's the 150 from Honda. Honda, with their 150s, they're just knocking them out of the park. And in this video, we're gonna do a showdown of both of these beasts, compare them side by side, so you can make a decision which bike is right for you. These are the best bang for the buck I've ever seen on a bike. They're so light, they're so small, but yet they pack a big punch. So let's get started in this video. You might be asking yourself, as a motorcycle rider, why should I get a scooter? Well, there's many reasons, and I've made quite a few videos comparing motorcycles to scooters. First of all, you can be a total hooligan in any of these bikes, and nobody cares. You are subtle, you are stealthy, riding around, and there's something about a tiny little scooter that makes sense for every rider. They're so easy to ride. They feel like bicycles. They're cheap. They get 100 miles to the gallon. What's not to like? When it comes to design, this thing is sleek. It's a sporty bike for city slickers, and it appeals to a lot of commuters than the ADV150 with its rugged appeal. Now, over here, we don't have a city slicker type of sleek bike. We have a bike that's much more rugged and appeals to riders who are into the adventure. For a long time, scooters were just kind of like this, city bikes. And with this, it gives it a little bit more pizzazz to go off-road with its longer suspension. And riding a scooter off-road is really quite fun. But you have to remember that scooters are just not that great for off-roading. So this will do really well in forest roads. If you want to have an RV and you put it in the back of your RV and go riding, this really is quite good. And you have something like this with more suspension, it handles city streets much better. I don't know about you, but downtown Washington, D.C. is not paved really well. When I take this down there, you feel all the bumps. On this, it's smooth. So let's talk about engines. Both of these bikes have the same engine, slightly tuned differently. This one makes about 14 horsepower. This makes about 13 horsepower. But they are tuned differently. The ADV150's engine is a little bit peppier and torquier, but that's pretty much it. It's not that this thing is going to be worlds faster than this with 13 horsepower. When it comes to wheels, 14 inches both up front. The ADV has got a 13-inch rear, which I do not like. And this thing, the tires on the ADV are wider, so combined with the suspension, it's a much nicer, smoother feeling than the tiny 110s in the front of the PCX. And of course, lower suspension. It does feel like it would benefit from better suspension on the PCX. And of course, this one has ABS brakes. That does not have ABS brakes. It does have link braking. It's a Honda thing. And link braking is great. I never had the need for ABS, but the brakes on the ADV are much better than the PCX. In the rear, you really see some big differences. First, you have shocks in the rear that are by Showa. Really good shocks, and they have 4.1 inches of travel, and it's got a 13-inch tire as opposed to the PCX's 14. And I believe the reason Honda did this is that they needed to create a little bit more suspension, and by making a smaller wheel with a wider rear tire, it would increase the suspension. But for me, I would prefer if Honda just gave us a 14-inch rear. That way, when you buy tires, you don't have to buy two different sizes. But it's in keeping with ADV style bikes, having a smaller wheel in the rear than in the front. But I don't think it's needed in this application. I think they could have possibly have designed it with 14s and just made it a little bit less complex with two different size wheels. But the big deal really is the suspension. The Showa suspension and the 5.1 travel in the front. It's much more comfortable having the suspension of the ADV than the PCX. The PCX has just got those old school coils, and they're not terribly good. They're too springy and soft. So when it comes to seat height, this is really where the PCX shines over that one. It is so much easier to get on this bike and ride than on the ADV. Of course, it's super simple. But one thing that I found is that this is bigger on the PCX than on the ADV. And if you do a lot of mounting and dismounting, it's easy not to hit this hump in the middle. You also have a lower seat height on the PCX, and you can flat foot it and have plenty of space. On the ADV150, it is, you can see I'm actually like on my tippy toes. It's no big deal, but the space here is wider and taller. It almost feels like Honda, they really didn't need to do this. They could have made the hump slightly lower, kind of like the PCX. Because one thing I found is that if you're doing stop and go, getting in, getting out, it's a little harder to get your foot off of it. And you're hitting the seat or you're hitting the plastic. When you look at the gas gap, it's actually much further down than the plastic. So they could have made this a little bit lower to have riders kind of get in and out without rubbing this. There should also be some sort of aftermarket that goes over the top here so you do not scratch the plastic. But that's really like one of the top things that I see against this bike. It's just kind of shorter, and the reason they made it shorter is that you can get on this bike and stand up on it. You can ride this standing up. The handlebars are kind of flat, kind of like a motocross handlebar, so it feels like you can do this. On the PCX, standing up on it is not recommended. It feels unstable, kind of hit your mirrors here. It's not great. And also the platform on the PCX is narrower. The entire profile of the PCX is shorter, thinner. And on this, everything about it feels wider. This is also slightly heavier than this. Not by a lot, but it's noticeable, especially with everything being down low on the PCX. You do feel that kind of like weight a little bit higher up on the ADV. You also have a much more commanding presence riding the ADV150 than the PCX. The PCX feels like you're really low to the ground, like an Elite 110. The ADV, you are higher up. So, of course, the seat on the PCX is smaller, it is lower, and at the same time, it's got this shape that creates an easy reach to the ground. On the ADV, it's flat. So this is one of the issues that why it's so much taller. The seat is taller, there's no doubt about it, but it's also flatter, making it harder to flat foot for shorter riders. And on the ADV, this hump here, it stands out a little bit more. So you have a little bit less distance here than the PCX. So there's a little bit more room between here on the PCX. The Honda ADV is probably about here. So it's like 2 or 3 inches higher than the PCX. And the entire bike, the entire PCX is lower. Just when you look at that hump, it's kind of smooth, round, small. And then you look at the Honda, it's flat, angular, a little bit awkward to dismount and mount. In and out of the bike on the PCX is much easier. It's lower to the ground, but there's also a little bit more space here. So from here to the seat, you have about 10 and a half inches. 9 inches. I am throwing my leg over. On the ADV, I found myself hitting the seat or the hump, because the hump is also higher up. If I measure from the ground, even though it's in the center stand, you are talking about 22 inches. And on the ADV, that is a good 20, 25, almost 26 inches up. So that's a big difference of the hump here and here. And get this, when you open up the gas cap is really very low, or almost flush with the plastic. You open up the gas cap on the ADV, this thing is so deep in here, and I wonder if they could have perhaps removed a little bit of this plastic and lowered it a little bit, just so you wouldn't have to do yoga in order to get in and out of this bike. It's shorter, it's wider, it makes climbing in and out a little bit more effort, not a lot, but, and it's so deep down here that when you put the filler cap, you're constantly overfilling because you can't really see the level kind of coming up to the neck. I mean, you're talking about 5.5 inches, 2.5 inches on the PCX. And of course, you have this about the same amount of space underneath the seat. This one is on a spring, and on the PCX, it's not on a spring. Up the seats and see how these differ. Look at that. First of all, one thing you notice is that the ADV150 has got a spring and it opens up to here. If you want to open it even more, you just bring it back. And on the PCX, you do not have that. This is about the same size. So when it comes to size for the trunk, the inside is about 25.5 inches. It's about 27 inches. So it's a little bit longer. And when it comes to width, 11 inches to 11.5 inches. So there's more space on the PCX than the ADV. It's about the same deepness as well, about 10 inches. That's actually a little bit less deep on that than this one. Awesome thing about the ADV is that you do not need anything to get to the battery and fuses. You just open up the seat and these little tabs just completely lock it in there. On the PCX, you have a little tab here. You have to push in order to get this out so you can access the battery and the fuses. ADV, you just have these little tabs, pull it out, get your battery tender in there, and it's simple. I like that door much more. On the PCX, you have your coolant bottle reservoir here, so you can fill up your coolant, and I still have plenty of coolant here. So the bottle reservoir for filling up the ADV is located here. You would have to pull this out, and then there's a cap. And of course, I do appreciate that the ADV150 seat kind of stays up at an angle, so you don't have to worry about it. There's like a little spring. The great features of the ADV is this: keyless ignition. Put this in your pocket and you can start the bike super easy. When it comes to keys, this one still uses keys, and it's got multi-position for the key. That's off, that's on for the seat and for the gas cap. Same thing that the ADV has, and then you have that. You hear the ignition and the fuel injection, and then you can start it right up. On the ADV, you have this. That's the same position for the key, except this is keyless. So you turn it one key, and the light kind of comes on. You open the seat and the fuel, and that's perfect. And then turn to the on position, and you have the ignition. And here's something that Honda did really well, and I like this much more. You have some braille texture here, and this pocket is quite large. And one thing you're going to notice is that on the here, it's kind of deep. It goes off to the side. It's got quite a bit of space. And tucked in, you have a 12-volt power accessory. And on the ADV, and look at the way this opens. This is kind of like lightweight, and it flares out so you can store more stuff. Now let's look at the PCX. You have a flat pocket, and this is terrible. This is such a terrible way of opening it up. And I have a bunch of papers here. This is not a deep pocket. You can't even put a wallet in here. You would have to put it at an angle. Speaking of terrible features, this is probably the most useless thing that Honda did, and they should not even have attempted to put this. This, of course, is the handbrake. It's a it's the worst handbrake I've ever seen on a scooter. There's another scooter I had, and it was a Kymco Exciting. That parking brake was also terrible. Honda would have given us a gift by just not including this, because it seems like it was not designed by Honda. First, you have to hold the brake, and then you have to push this out, and it locks, but it never really, you have to use two hands for this. It's the most ridiculous piece of engineering I've seen on a Honda. Now let's look at the ADV. You have the left brake and this little thing. That's all you need. So you can use the parking brake just using that little lever, and to disengage it, push it, and it's done. Simple. That's exactly what we would want on the PCX. Hopefully they fixed it with the new PCX, because that other design is just terrible. On the ADV, we have an aftermarket rack, but even with the stock handrails, it is better than the PCX. One thing I cannot stand is the grab rail on the PCX. It's styled to be sleek and sporty on the PCX, but on this, much more usable. You can wrap bungees around, tie things to the rear. And on the PCX, you don't have a way of looping the grab rail around here. So you have to like use this part to strap things, and I like rolling things through here. There are bungees that you can't do that. So in a way, I do appreciate the styling that they did. I mean, it's a beautiful design. It goes along with the design of the PCX, but it's not as functional as the ADV's grab rails. When you look at good grab rails, it makes the utility of a scooter, which is kind of like what most people use scooters for, much better than having something that's difficult to use. ADV, you have passenger foot pegs, and not great. I think they missed a little bit on making it a little bit more streamlined and to go along with the design, but it's not really a deal breaker. And on the PCX, it's the same sort of thing, but it actually goes along with the design much more. It doesn't seem like it's an afterthought that Honda had on the ADV. It goes along with the lines of the plastic. I think it's a much better design. It kind of gets tucked away. It's just so much more sleeker. Even though it might not look it on video, the rear end of the ADV150 is higher up than the rear end of the PCX. And the reason I mentioned that is that if you are mounting a bag, if you're doing food delivery, for example, you have a bag here. On the PCX, it's easy to load. On here, it's so higher up. And notice that the seat in the rear is slanted up, as opposed to the PCX's kind of leveling down. So it kind of curves down on the PCX, as opposed to the angular line of the ADV kind of going up. So when you have a top box mounted here as a food delivery bag, it's a little harder to kind of like put things in there, remove them, especially if you're doing it hundreds of times. And when you measure this is about 35 and a half inches on the seat. It's about 34 inches. So 2 inches makes a big difference. When you get to the spark plug, right here, you have a little door here that you remove. It's the same thing on the PCX. That same door, of course, I bashed it in with my feet. That's one thing that happens if you use these quite a bit. It would be nice to have some sort of way of protecting the plastic from your feet because you're constantly like hitting things and rubbing the sides. Now it feels like there should be an aftermarket for some sort of way of putting something that's rubberized, kind of like the floor mat on here. Because what happens with these hard plastic bits is that they get worn out and then you have to replace them if you really want your bike to be minty. The Honda ADV, more so than the PCX because it's harder to mount and dismount with the amount of bulk that you have in the middle. And you can start to see that on the PCX, I have started to damage the plastics just by the amount of foot rubbing that I have hit that side of the plastic. Here's a brilliant thing that Honda did. These things, you can actually adjust it and move up the windscreen. Of course, the stock windscreen on the ADV150 is just terrible and it doesn't deflect much wind, so it's not that great. In comparison, the aftermarket windscreen I have on the PCX is great. Even in the summer, even in the winter, it works out much better. Exhaust on the PCX is just terrible looking. Even the plastic, of course mine looks much worse. It's got this here. I wish it looked a little bit more modern and better. In contrast to the PCX, you do have a very nice exhaust can that's angled up. The exhaust on the PCX is so much lower and it is nicer to have something that looks more modern. This is a cool look, I think. And I believe that you still have to remove the exhaust to access the wheel, which is a thing that most scooters do have, even the big ones. Unfortunately, you can't really get away from that. I do love this taillight. It is extremely bright, especially at night, and it's got an X pattern. Of course, LEDs everywhere on the ADV. And on the PCX, you have halogen. I did put an LED bulb in here, but one thing that you're gonna find right away is that the brake light is just mounted so much lower than the ADVs. And I do find that higher up brake lights are better for visibility than these low rider kind of positions. And then you have standard blinkers. I mean, these are, you can just get them anywhere. This is probably something that I could possibly just upgrade, get some LED bulbs in here, some LED blinkers. Comes to the dash. On the ADV, you have the ADV branding up here. You have a bunch of like really nice setup. The screen is absolutely tiny. And when I start it up, it might be hard to see. There's a little animation that plays, and then you have a tiny speedometer. And it's not hard to see. There's a lot of information on there. So when it comes to the dash on the ADV, of course, it's much more modern. It's all digital. There's nothing analog about it, except right here you have a separate screen with the indicator lights, including the turn signals and high beam, engine light, that usual stuff. You also have ABS, and you also have a key light. So if your key is within range, it will show up on here, because you will not be able to start it if you don't see that little sign. And here you have your, it might be hard to see, but you have your speedometer right in the middle. Then you have your fuel gauge on the upper left. You have a average fuel consumption. And then here, which is a little strange, you have the instant fuel consumption. And then there's a bar that goes all the way to 200. And it just doesn't seem like they thought about that. It would be much better to have the same sort of number for fuel consumption, because it doesn't have that. It's just a weird gauge with a dial. And then here you have trip 1, trip A, trip B, and then odometer. You have time and a date, and this is your button for cycling through. Push. It also gives you the air temperature, which is really nice. You also have a light that comes on when you need to change the oil, which I appreciate. And of course, this is your other button to reset the gauge. A little bit nicer with color. You know, the NC700 that I just sold, it had a color screen. So it doesn't have to have all LCD style. They could have made it with a little bit more color. Also, a nice thing that they are starting to put on bikes is like these little caps, these little shaders, these visors that protect the screen. It's a little bit difficult to see, and I think they could definitely improve on that. Perhaps the 160 is an improvement on it, but it is a decent speedometer, just a little overly complex, and I think if they wanted to make it better, they should incorporate CarPlay or something like that. Now, in contrast to the ADV, this is pretty much all analog, and the speedometer kind of sits inside the bike, so you're kind of looking down at the speedometer. I thought at first it would be a little distracting having this like so far down, but it is nice that you have a lot of visibility on the scooter because everything is positioned down. On here, in the middle, very well designed, you have the speedometer, and it's miles per hour. It also has kilometers per hour, and when you turn it on, it's a nice color. So this lights up really well at night. You have a couple indicators on the left and right. Turn signals are upper left and upper right. You have the engine light, and then you have a little tiny digital screen, and this is where Honda really kind of lacks it. I have the trip 1 and odometer. That's all you get. That's all the information that you get. It would be nice to have more info, but of course the new PCX 160, they do have much more better information. And when you turn on the ignition on the ADV150, you hear the primer for the fuel injection, but the headlights come on automatically. On the PCX, the headlights do not come on. I do like this feature much more because if you're just like idling and stuff, you don't want the headlights to come on. Now they're on, high beam, low beam, low beam. It kind of looks like How to Train Your Dragon, the headlight of the little ADV150. So that's low beam, high beam, a little bit hard to see during daylight. Then the traditional PCX. This is what the ADV150 sounds like at idle. It's traditionally a ADV thing to have a dirt bike that's got a 21-inch front wheel, and then you have a smaller rear wheel. It's actually a pretty comfortable seating position and everything. This might have the PCX beat for comfort. Nice. The PCX, I'm very comfortable going around corners. I prefer the PCX's 14-inch tires all around. It's tarmac, but it's got like gravel on top. It's one of those mid type of roads. And this one is pretty cool looking, I have to admit. They do come in different colors, but not like these little scooters, these little tiny bikes. They're fun. Full throttle, 60 miles an hour. These bumps on the PCX kill me. 63 miles an hour and I hit the rev limiter. 63, 64. That's it, 64 miles an hour. It's the same speed as the PCX. Same speed as the PCX, but much better suspension. It doesn't feel like you're really going at that speed. On the PCX, it feels like you're going faster. Now I'm going uphill. It's not going 65, 63, 62. I'm at 59. They just lost 1 mile per hour, so not bad.
not bad. You know, for a 150, a lot of the 100s, they lose speed going up hills. So I'm at 58. It lost 2 miles per hour, 3 miles per hour. It's not great, but at the same time, that's not surprising that it's going to lose a little bit at the top. The PCX feels like it holds that speed better, if you can believe it. Maybe it's the bigger wheels, maybe it's like less rotating mass. It just feels like it's a little bit better on the highway than this one. A little more natural, a little more comfortable on the PCX. The ADV has got like a little aggressive type of handlebar. It's flatter, but this one's kind of like high up. It feels much nicer to ride. But of course, you know, maybe I'm just more comfortable on this bike because I've been using it for so long. Okay, just riding this back to back with the ADV, I'm like, yeah, it sits lower, but it's more comfortable. The ergonomics of this bike are a little nicer than the ADV, I think. And you know, maybe my body's just gotten used to this bike, and it could potentially be that. But this bike was a little taller, it probably would be very comparable. But well, you know, I was thinking that the ADV150 would be a hit, like head and shoulders above the PCX, and it really isn't. It's a great bike, but I thought it would be better than the PCX. And the PCX is a little bit more comfortable. It's easier for food delivery too, with a lower seat height and lower height for the little hump in the middle. So in a way, the ADV50, it just looks cool. But time will tell, because I haven't really ridden it that much. I just had like that initial impression. Generally, when you ride a good suspended bike, you'll feel them a little bit, like the imperfections, but it's not jarring. And on this, you kind of feel it being a little jarring.
As per usual, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next.